Hello and welcome to the Rabyd Atheist. I'm Rabyd, a former pastor turned atheist, now a compassionate anti-theist. Welcome to my channel. If you want to learn how to support the channel and its mission to normalize atheism and deconversion, stay tuned to the end of the video. Today I'm reacting to Frank Truek as he explains how the moral argument proves the existence of God. Given this week is largely about morality, as I'm kicking off my Morality Without God series at the end of the week, I thought it would be a little bit appropriate to review and deal with some stuff about the moral argument. But Frank Truek is a supposed noted apologist, and I don't think that I've reacted to him giving the moral argument before, so let's begin.
The next night I was there, about a 50-year-old man got up to the microphone, and he had a question written on 2 sheets of paper, and he began to read it. About 10 seconds into reading the question, he just broke down crying. He couldn't go any further. So I walked off the platform, I went down to him, and he handed me these 2 sheets of paper. And all he said was, "Read it, read it." So I'm trying to digest this 2-page question as I'm walking back up to the platform. By the time I got back up to the platform, I realized that that man was upset for 2 reasons. Reason number 1, that man, whose name turned out to be Steve, had just discovered recently that a supposed friend of his, a man by the name of Tom, about a 50-year-old man, had been sexually abusing Steve's daughter from the time she was age 4 to the time she was age 14. Right in his own home, under his nose, never saw it. The second reason Steve was upset was because the 2 men who were there the night before were his sons, who used to be Christians and are now atheists. They said, there can't be a good God because he wouldn't have allowed this to happen to our sister. There is no God.
Yeah, that's a pretty reasonable response given what happened. 10 years of abuse and God did nothing. So I would say Steve's son's response is pretty reasonable. Either God had no desire to stop it, so he's not benevolent. I'm sorry. If I became aware of this, I would do everything in my power to stop it, and I'm just a mere human. He can't be all-powerful, so why call him God in that sense? Or he didn't know, so he's not omniscient. But let's see if Frank moves from the emotional appeal of the argument to actually dealing with some of these objections.
So I said to him, Steve, it's okay to be mad at God. Some of the Bible writers are mad at God. Read Habakkuk, read the Psalms, some of the Psalms, read Lamentations. God, where are you? God can take it. He's an infinite being. But I hope at some point your sons are going to realize this is not a good argument against God. In fact, it's actually an argument for God.
What?
Really? This is very much the problem of evil argument, is considered one of the strongest against the omni-God by even many theists' own admission. But Frank here is saying it isn't so. I'm wondering what his rationale is. In order to counter the emotional appeal Frank is using, I want to be very clear what Frank is allowing for, because he's already getting away what happened to this girl and God's supposed relationship to those events already to make his points. He pulled everybody in with the emotional appeal, and now he's pushing it aside. I want to make it abundantly clear that this girl was repeatedly sexually assaulted over a period of a decade by her father's friend, to the point that, based on what happens in the rest of the video, she's justifying it in her own mind. She's written a book about it, and she wanted in this context to marry the very guy that was doing this to her. That's how far the brainwashing and the grooming went. This guy is still walking around because his brainwashing of this woman is so deep that every time she gets up to testify, she can't do it. God's involvement isn't simply that he just didn't do anything about it, which indicates his lack of power or desire, but he was literally in the room every time the man did something to this little girl. Every time she was sexually assaulted, every time she was asked to do something to him, every time that something happened in an unspeakable way, God was there, literally in the room, watching everything, experiencing everything, knowing exactly what each one of them was thinking and doing, exactly what the little girl was experiencing. He was literally in this room, literally knowing everything about this situation, and did nothing to stop it. Okay, he doesn't. Her cries are repeatedly ignored. God simply watches it all happen. The abuse takes place week after week, month after month, year after year, and God does nothing. Frank is never going to address this question. In fact, he's going to hand wave it away at the end. But I want everybody to remember this, because I must ask the question at this point. If there was another man in this room, even though finite in power, but still having the ability to stop it, who didn't help the girl, who knew what was going on, who, unlike the girl's father, knew everything that was going on and didn't do anything about it, what would we think about that man? Would we think he was good? Would we think of him as someone who desired justice for her? I don't think so.
Why? In fact, here's what I said to him. I said, when the time is right, Steve, I want you to say this to your sons. If there is no God, what that 50-year-old man did to your sister isn't really wrong. It's just your opinion.
Everything that guy just says is bullshit.
I'm sorry, this is pure grade A bullshit, okay, as Frank is being very narrow in his concept of moral questions and moral philosophy. What constitutes good and evil is more than just an opinion. We can evaluate various standards of what we think is good and evil and see if they pass the test. There's been a lot of philosophical discussions on what good and evil is. Secularists have made definitions of good and evil that don't have anything to do with your opinion. And so his notion that this is just opinion versus opinion is completely a load of crap. What he's trying to do is take the subjectivity of morality, which exists, and trying to push this whole idea that subjectivity equals everybody's opinion. But that's not necessarily true. Frank is basically hand-waving a lot of answers to the idea of good and evil being defined by human beings themselves. The fact is, good and evil can be and has been defined by human beings. But Frank is really assuming that his objective standard of morality exists because of his God. I would say his God is a poor example of good, sitting in the corner night after night while this little girl is repeatedly sexually assaulted. How is he good at that point?
Why? Because if there's no standard beyond humanity, it's just his opinion against yours. By the way, the man who did this is still walking the streets. Why? Everyone knows he did it, but he's not in jail. Because every time the trial comes up, Jessica, the one who was abused, psychologically checks out. She can't testify against him. She wanted to marry him. So I said, Steve, when the right time comes, I want you to say this to your sons. If there is no God, then the man who did this to your sister will never get justice. He's not going to get justice here on earth if she doesn't testify, and he's not going to get justice in the afterlife because according to atheism, there is no afterlife. Do you really think that's the way the universe is?
The universe works the way it works, regardless of my desires or feelings about it. Frank is using an emotional appeal to support a desire, but that still does not prove his God. Just because I want justice to happen doesn't mean that I get to make up a God that will give it to me and then it will suddenly appear in reality. Wishful thinking doesn't make what I'm wishing for real. One of the harsh realities I must accept as an atheist sometimes is justice does not always get done. It has a deep emotional appeal that we want justice to be done, but my emotions don't shape reality. And Frank here is doing everything to make this emotional appeal he's giving shape the reality of his audience. I think afterlife mythologies, for instance, are largely created because we want a desire for justice and we fear life, we fear death. But desires and fear don't suddenly make what we wish to be true. Just because I desire justice for something doesn't make a cosmic final judge just appear.
Do you really think there's no such thing as justice? The very reason you're upset, rightfully so, is because you know a great injustice has been done. But there can't be justice, or I should say there can't be injustice unless there's...
Yeah, but your assumption is justice comes from God is still just an assumption. How is it just if God sits in a corner while a man sexually assaults a little girl for decades, for a whole decade, and does nothing about it? Where is the justice for the little girl at that point, and how is God then a good standard for it? You know, I'm beginning to think that by bringing up this story, you actually are disproving the existence of your God. You just don't realize it. What sickens me is that Frank who is now using this woman in this story to get everybody rolling on how injustice is happening with the human justice system, but then conveniently avoids the fact that God watched and allowed her to be repeatedly sexually assaulted over a decade and did nothing about it. How does that make him good or just? It calls into the question the nature of God when he allows these things to happen, and it's an important consideration in the problem of evil. If anything, it shows this God doesn't provide a good standard for goodness or justice. It actually makes him an accomplice to many of the crimes that this man committed.
Justice, in fact, C.S. Lewis put it best. He said evil requires good and good requires God. He says, as an atheist, my argument against God was that the universe seems so cruel and unjust, but how had I got this idea of just and unjust? A man does not call a line crooked unless he has some idea of a straight line. What was I comparing this universe with when I called it unjust? In fact, it's been also put this way. The shadows prove the sunshine. In other words, in order to have evil, you have to have good. In order to have shadows, you have to have sunshine. Oh, you can have sunshine without shadows. You can have good without evil, but you can't have evil without good.
Do not human beings draw both straight lines and crooked ones for comparison? Do we not have the ability to make that comparison between crooked and straight lines and make a moral value judgment kind of thing? It seems like we do both, that we are capable of both comparing things and noting their differences and also creating the two things that we're saying. No God required. We have human standards of justice that we created that take the form of codified laws, and I can't see that God is necessary for them. He was getting the standards of justice and justice from the same place. That is, C.S. Lewis was getting those same standards from the same place himself. Human beings provide this idea as a way to interact as a social species. This is pretty well known. Evil requires good, but shadows prove sunshine. Wouldn't that require then the existence of shadows to prove that sunshine exists? So both good and evil are necessary for each other? I'm sure that's not what you meant, but I'm kind of thinking this points out to a weakness in your analogy and why it doesn't really work all that well. I think we can conceive of both good and evil without the necessity of the other. And we don't have to have that. Honestly, the idea of good and evil is a debatable point and something that we really need to determine long before we even have this discussion. But Frank wants to jump into the middle and assume a lot of definitions of good and evil based on his God without proving it.
Now, if something's evil out there, and Michael will agree there are many things that are evil, then there must be something good. What is that good? That good is God's nature.
What?
That's a big leap. You haven't even proven that God exists to be a standard of good in the first place. That's why the moral argument fails. It begs the question right away, assuming that there's a moral lawgiver that has to give the laws, and calling that lawgiver God is begging the question. If you're trying to prove the existence of God, and that's part of your premises. It also assumes that an objective standard for morality exists, and somehow that's connected to God, but that wouldn't make it objective anymore. It'd be subjective to whatever God exists that it's connected to. You're assuming here at this point and asserting it into the discussion without justifying any of this. You haven't proven God even exists, begging the questions of existence, proven which God we are talking about, which has a bearing on the nature of who God is and whether he is good or malevolent or benevolent. And you continue to ignore that objective standards of good and justice cannot have a God involved because that would make them subjected to that God, whoever he or she may be. Sorry, you're making a really big leap of logic there, Frank, without any justification.
If there is no God, then there's nothing ultimately good or bad. There are just molecules bumping into one another.
This is an oversimplification of what people say reality is. Morality is a reality because of social species need it to survive and thrive. I'm not really a hard determinist myself and still an atheist. I don't think we know enough yet to determine if everything is determined. One thing I do take from my open theism days is an understanding that there is, in fact, very few choices actually available to us, and it's quite limited. My own view on the subject is fate to me is that which I cannot control, and so I stick within the realm of what I can control. It's a very stoic idea, and that's why I follow Stoicism, because it fits me. But at the same time, we might have evolved in a way to have genuine choices about our choices. Don't really know enough, in my opinion, to really think one way or the other. The fact is, atheists are not in agreement at this point. So I'm going to call a small straw man at this point. While some atheists do believe in hard determinism, not all of them do. And some of them even have a sense of spirituality to the world, which I don't possess, but they do. And so there you have it. I think you're kind of just making a very large assumption about what this would entail if God didn't exist.
Now, Jessica, the girl that was abused, decided to do something positive with this awful experience. She actually wrote a book. Here it is, Not Your Princess by Jessica Mitchell. I read one chapter of this book and couldn't read it anymore. Why am I telling you this? Because her father Steve wants as many people as possible to know this, because this happens too often in American homes. Now, ladies and gentlemen, is the sexual abuse of children evil? Yes. Then God exists. I know that sounds counterintuitive, because Michael's going to ask, why would he allow it to happen? That's a whole other conversation.
Sorry, it's not just counterintuitive. It doesn't logically follow. This is a huge leap because I don't think you've even connected the dots as to why God would have allowed all this in the first place. But also, you haven't even proven that God exists to be the moral lawgiver or judge. You're just assuming it. We don't know anything about this God's nature because you haven't proven what God actually exists and what his nature is in relationship to whatever moral standard he gives. There's so much that goes into this question, and Frank is basically just begging the question at this point about the existence of God, assuming that his theory of morality and God is the only one to be considered that works.
But the point is, you can't say God doesn't exist, because it wouldn't be evil unless he did exist, because he's the standard of good by which we'd even know what evil was. He is the standard of measurement.
God being the standard of measurement for good and justice is an assumption you didn't really prove here, Frank. You just leapt to it without connecting it to the rest of the discussion at all. But the question of why God allowed it goes deeper than you are letting it go, and it may be a separate question, but it is a very related one to the problem of evil. But you channel the emotional appeal to speak well of your position without realizing it also speaks powerfully against your God, being good, just, powerful, all-knowing, and everywhere present. Because something has to give when you come to a full realization that if your God is true, he sat in a corner for a decade, ignoring a little girl crying, her cries for help, and her needless suffering. He watched while being fully capable of stopping her abuse, but didn't. This makes him a very poor example of what goodness is, and he certainly isn't a standard of justice when he could have provided justice almost immediately to the man. He just allowed the crimes against her to continue to happen. So is he desirous to have crime so he can sit later as a judge because he gets a kick out of being a judge? It seems like in order to get beyond justice, we would want to start off with doing good things in the first place so justice isn't necessary. We'd want to prevent injustice so that justice isn't necessary. Okay, well, the best way to have prevented this is to stop it from happening in the first place. But God didn't stop any of this from happening. He just let it go. And I'd have to ask, what is his motive for doing so, for allowing such needless suffering in the world? That somehow a 4-year-old girl is so guilty of something heinous, like being a sinner, that she has to suffer like this? For what? Okay, I'm sorry, your God doesn't make any sense at that point, and that's why I don't think he exists. The problem of evil is a very powerful argument for this reason, but I've noticed that apologists continue to kind of avoid the full impact and force of the argument. The fact is, this is a very powerful argument against the existence of God, a particular God in particular, the omni-God. And that's why it's something that I continue to use as, I don't believe in the Christian God or this omni-God for that very reason. Not to mention that if we're going to use the God of the Bible as a standard of morality, he's a very poor one. He kills people for no reason other than they piss him off. He has no standard of justice or, layering his justice. Minor crimes and major crimes are punished exactly the same, death. Okay, in my God Kills series, we've seen God kill for just, people complaining. That's just kind of dumb. It just shows a very tyrannical nature and doesn't really give us a standard of justice. Even if human beings argue over the standard of justice and injustice, they seem to have a better one than the God Yahweh of the Bible, so let's dismiss him. But then again, Frank doesn't really deal with the question of which God we're talking about, whether God exists in the first place. He just makes this leap at the end to just assume that they exist to answer the question of goodness, justice, and everything else, while at the same time telling a story that undercuts all of that. And here's the real kicker. It's not just that it happened once to this little girl, now woman, who's having to deal with the ramifications of her abuse over a decade. This happens all the time, all over the world, everywhere, and God knows all of it. God witnesses every act of abuse and does nothing about it. It seems like if he were a just God, then he would stop it so injustice doesn't take place in the first place. The real way to bring about justice is not after the fact, but at the moment that it's about to take place, when injustice is about to happen, prevent it from happening. But God doesn't do this. He willfully sits back and does nothing. He doesn't use his power to stop it. He certainly doesn't demonstrate his benevolence. He certainly doesn't do anything related to stopping the injustice of it. He knows everything that's going on, or he doesn't. That's why he doesn't do anything. So maybe he's not all-knowing. He's not everywhere present then, because if he was everywhere present, he would witness and be directly involved in every aspect of abusive situations, but he does nothing about it. It's almost like he doesn't exist. Maybe he just doesn't exist. Well, that's my final comments, other than to say I found what Frank did to be a little bit despicable. Because on the one hand, he's really using this woman's emotional trauma to make his point about, oh, well, then she's never going to receive justice if there is no God. That's true. And sometimes you just have to face the reality of that's the way the world is. But he doesn't also realize that if God is omnipresent and omniscient, God knew about every single time very intimately of what happens to her as a little girl, as a teenage young woman, and does nothing about it. This doesn't speak to God's goodness, but his ungoodness. Yes, it is a separate question, sort of, but it's a very related question. And basically, Frank hand waves the idea of why did God allow it to happen away, which is the essential element of the problem of evil. He kind of skirts around the edges of the problem of evil, but doesn't deal with its core, which is why does God allow these things to happen? And it is the most essential question. And he kind of hand waves it away in this one. I don't know if he actually addresses it later in this presentation when the other guy gets up and points this out. But at this point, Frank should have really focused on that. But it's also interesting how apologists always do this. Frank is not the only one that just gives an emotional appeal to this idea of justice and all this other stuff. But emotional appeals don't work unless something already exists in humanity for them to work. So we already have a sense of justice and injustice. We have a sense of good and evil inherently within us. Why do we need God for that then at that point? But he has to appeal to that while at the same time ignoring it. So I guess I'm kind of, most of the time when I deal with Frank, I get a little disgusted because of the way he handles it. He uses other people's issues in order to make his attempts. I don't like the fact that he's always dealing with college kids instead of taking on heavy hitters more and more often. People that actually know what they're talking about because I think he's kind of afraid of that. I know that he went on Apologia once and I haven't seen him back since. And that's because Apologia is very knowledgeable at the subject they were talking about and pretty much kind of ended, the debate, I guess. So that's kind of what happened. But I'm always interested in your thoughts, so give me some thoughts about what you think about what Frank did here or what you think I said, and I'd be glad to listen and hear them out. Thanks for stopping by. I appreciate it. Like, share, and subscribe. You guys are awesome. The many ways to support the channel, from my PayPal link in the description to Super Chat, Super Thanks, all that stuff goes a long way to helping me, do what I do in normalizing atheism and deconversion. Atheists should not be looked down upon because they're atheists any more than anybody else who believes in something should be looked down upon for any reason. These are very debatable, honest points, and I think atheists have been demonized over the years and created into something that we really aren't. And so I work to, get rid of that misunderstanding, and also that people are deconverting and giving up faith altogether. I think that's fairly normal, and I think it's something that people shouldn't look down upon or treat people differently simply because they're going through it. And so I work hard to kind of dispel the myths about atheism and deconversion. So if you want to help me do that, that's one of the ways to do it. But the best way is membership. Being a member of this channel gives me that regular monthly support that allows me to worry less and less about the YouTube algorithm and more about giving the content that you guys come to love and enjoy. So consider being a member. And I just want to give a shout out to my members, to my citizens, to my Rabyd citizens, and to my Tribunes. Thank you very much. You guys are awesome. I appreciate you. And as always, live your best life. You only get one go around and then it's over, and there's no afterlife to look forward to. So you might as well take all your time, money, and opportunities and give them to yourself, to the people you love and care for, and to make this a better world. And don't waste them on the trappings of religion and faith, because that's a dead end. I speak from experience. And as always, thanks for stopping by, and I'll catch you next time.